Chevrolet, America's...
David Wickman was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1953, of course the very same year that Corvette made its debut. So it was no wonder that he gravitated toward Corvette and automobiles in general.
My cousin had a 62 Corvette. That's where I first got to sit in one and get a ride in a Corvette and look around really closely at Corvettes and things like that. It was also the era, 62, 63, where the 63 Stingray came out, split window coupe. XKE Jags were running around, and you would just see them in parking lots, and just this natural tendency to want to go and look at these cars. You felt drawn to the car, you go up to it, you kind of peer in the window of the car like that, looking at the interior, just dreaming about what it would be like to be sitting in that car and driving that car.
Dave read everything he could about Corvette, which led him to the October 1969 issue of Motor Trend magazine, and the article that would change the trajectory of his life.
October 1969. It was a very special issue in my mind. A very good article covering the full Chevrolet line of vehicles, but there was also a special article called the 10-Second Trip. It was an article about the 1969 Corvette that had been developed by the Corvette engineers to build a purpose-built drag car, basically, with a ZL1 engine in it, which was the all-aluminum big block engine. I used to read that magazine over and over and over again, because in there was like the ultimate car. This was a Corvette that ran a quarter-mile best time of 10:60 at 132 miles an hour. The article was very detailed technically, and it brought in personalities involved. One of them was Tom Langton, and then Gib Hufstadter, who was the engineer in charge of the car. And there's pictures of both of them in that magazine, quotes from them, and how they developed this car and how it came to be what it was, and the performance that it had, which was pretty incredible performance for the time frame of 1969 to see a car run 10-second quarter miles with basically Chevrolet service parts that you could buy at your dealer and make your car do this. I read about this car and thought how awesome this was, how cool the car was, what incredible jobs these guys have to work on this car. It's like, wow, this is the ultimate that could ever happen to you. And these guys had the ultimate job. To be working on that kind of a car was awesome. I really want to work at the Proving Grounds. I wanted to work at General Motors.
The Proving Grounds themselves also fascinated Dave. Opening in 1924 in Milford, Michigan, it was the very first test facility of its kind ever built by an automotive manufacturer.
It's like heaven on earth. I just absolutely fell in love with the whole facility, just all the roads that you had, and the test facility, the garages, the people working on cars. He actually found some place at GM where everybody was working on cars all the time. That's all they did, was had cars torn down and putting them together, and going out and driving them, evaluating them, and on this what I'd call a vast array of test facilities and surfaces and roads that represented just about everything you could think of. How could you not fall in love with a place like that?
Some of those things had to be put on the back burner for a number of years because you need to get through college and pursue an engineering career, which seemed like the right thing for me. Upon graduation in 1975, it was a bad year in the auto industry. There weren't a lot of opportunities. Ford Motor Company was looking for people at that time frame, and I hired into Ford as an engineer. But the opportunity opened up in November 1977 to interview at the Proving Grounds. I started on January 5th, 1978. Along the way of doing that, they had an opening in the Corvette development group for a test engineer. And the Corvette development manager at the time was Fred Shaftsma. And Fred had seen me working on that and realized that I was dedicated and serious, and I think he felt I had talent. So when he went looking for a new test engineer, he asked to have me placed in his group.
Back in 1983, I became the development manager for the Corvette at the Proving Grounds, and that's when I first met Dave Wickman, was within that group. As I spent some time with that group then for the next couple of years, I began to rely more on Dave, and that's how I got to know Dave the best, was through that work in the early 90s. Kind of solidified for me that Dave was the guy that I'd like to see replace me when I moved on.
Dave Wickman, he had a credible attention to detail. He never lost focus in making, and pushing all his team to make the Corvettes, not just performance by the numbers, but the feel, the feeling you got. And that was one of the big things with the 7th generation versus the 6th generation. The numbers were of course better, but the way the car felt and when you drove it, and the experiences you got as a driver just made it so much more rewarding, and Dave Wickman was a big part of that. Yeah, and Dave Wickman has the distinction of working four chief engineers for Corvette, from McClellan to Hill to Wallace to Tadge Juchter, and really starting in the later days, I think, with the third generation car into the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh, and even some of the early discussions we had of the eighth generation. Dave's fingerprints is really all over when you drive a Corvette.
Dave had a great career at the Proving Grounds. He really did. And early in his career, he worked for Shaftsma, who worked for me, and I think he started to really learn his trade at that point in his career. And David was a very quiet engineer. He did the job, and he got it done.
They put the finishing touches on the car and make the car come together. They start with a rough prototype and finish with a finished car, but he was a real force at the Proving Grounds to make the cars real and make them be better and better each time. Dave Wickman was a standout, did a lot for our group, and he is a very brilliant engineer.
Dave was the last engineer that I remember wearing a pocket protector. And he always had the pocket protector on, and there was always a pen, a pencil, a highlighter, and a Sharpie, sometimes several colors of Sharpies. And so whenever I was at the Milford Proving Grounds and I needed a writing instrument and didn't have one, I just looked Dave up and I could grab any writing instrument he had, and I just loved it to death. He was such a down-to-earth guy. But probably the most important thing about Dave is he was one of the guys that knew the Corvette family of customers. He knew what the Corvette needed, and he always was able to steer the team, the development teams, to make sure that the car had those attributes that the customer wanted, etc. He totally understood the customer experience and how important that was, even to the point where, and this is a rare thing to have happen, he was able to open up the Milford Proving Grounds and allow a large group of Corvette owners through the Corvette Museum to be able to come in and actually experience their car on Corvette grounds. And believe me, that's rare. And it was such a great experience that it just shows you how important he thought the customer experience was.
So I would have met Dave for the first time in the late 80s. I started in Milford Proving Grounds in the development group also, not a Corvette, on another program. Dave was on Corvette, and he'd actually been there for a while already. I spent like 3 years at the development group, eventually becoming the manager of the group, and so I was part of the performance conversation about people all around the department. And so that's when I realized how well respected Dave was. He was unanimously praised as one of the best development engineers in the entire facility.
So when I was there working as a Corvette test engineer, and I got to meet Gib Hufstadter, engineer to engineer, for the first time in my life, and I thought, what a fantastic opportunity this is. I mentioned to him this October 1969 Motor Trend article, and I actually had a copy of it in my briefcase. I carried it around everywhere I went, and I pulled it out and showed it to Gib and said, Gib, I said, I read about you back when I was 16 years old, and you're an inspiration to me, really, basically. It was really a amazing experience. I remember being out in Arizona with Gib. We were at our desert proving ground, which was in Mesa, Arizona, and headed back to the hotel at night. We would both be in Corvettes. At the time it would have been 84 Corvettes, and we would get stopped at traffic lights side by side, and we would just kind of practice to see who could launch the car better, if you want to call it that, away from the traffic light. Being mindful of speed limits, but just trying to see who could launch the car better and things of that nature. It's like, this is the guy I read about once again in 1969, and here we are working hand in hand on the Corvette. So it was really an amazing experience.
You're pointing out that my contact with him was very beneficial for his life and so forth. So I would feel very proud that I was positive enough to keep him enthused about working at Chevrolet. He really obviously took that to heart. very honored by those thoughts.
When you drive a Corvette, and if you love the way that it handles, the way it performs on all road conditions, whether on the track or the street, you have to thank Dave Wickman for that.
If I were doing car programs today someplace, I very likely would hire him because he's very, very well trained, and he loves working, and it doesn't get any better than that.
In some ways, I sort of patterned myself, like, wow, what has that guy got that I would like to be able to do as well. So I really spent my sort of formative years in vehicle development almost as an understudy to Dave. I don't think he was aware of that, but people like Dave who went about their job in a very deliberate way and super capable way, that was part of something I aspired to be as well.
He worked closest with me, and he's one of my heroes.
And that was like the ultimate dream. It's like, how could you be any luckier than to start out wanting to work at General Motors to begin with for your whole life as an engineer, and finally get into General Motors, finally get into the Proving Grounds where you wanted to work. And once you got into the Proving Grounds, finally get into Chevrolet Engineering, which was the coolest place there was in my mind. And then finally working on Corvette was the premier Chevrolet performance car. So it was a dream come true for me.
For achieving his childhood dream and his work that made the dreams of countless Corvette owners come true, we welcome David Wickman into the Corvette Hall of Fame.